Chapter 5. Noah Claypole. Oliver, being left to himself in the undertaker's shop, set the lamp down on a bench and looked around him. An unfinished coffin, which stood in the middle of the shop, made him tremble with fear every time his eyes wandered in its direction. He almost expected to see some terrible form raise its head out of it to drive him mad with terror. He was woken in the morning by a loud kicking at the outside of the shop door, and he hurried to unlock the chain.
"Open the door, will you?"
an angry voice kept saying while he did this. "It will be opened soon, sir," replied Oliver, turning the key and removing the chain.
"I suppose you're the new boy, are you?"
said the voice. "Yes, sir," replied Oliver.
"How old are you?"
inquired the voice.
10, sir," replied Oliver.
"Then I'll whip you when I get in,"
said the voice, and, having made this kind promise, the speaker began to whistle. Oliver pulled back the bolts with a trembling hand and opened the door. He looked up the street and down the street, but he saw nobody but a slightly older boy, sitting on a post in front of the house and eating bread and butter.
"I beg your pardon, sir,"
said Oliver finally, seeing that no other visitor made his appearance.
"Did you knock?"
"I kicked,"
replied the boy.
"Did you want a coffin, sir?"
asked Oliver. At this the older boy looked cross and said that Oliver would soon want one himself if he continued to make jokes with his seniors.
"You don't know who I am, I suppose, workhouse?"
said the boy.
"No, sir,"
replied Oliver.
"I'm Mr Noah Claypole,"
said the boy.
"and you work under me."
With this, Mr Claypole gave Oliver a kick and entered the shop. Mr and Mrs Sowerberry came down soon after that, and Oliver followed Noah downstairs.
"Come near the fire, Noah," said Charlotte. "I saved a nice bit of bacon for you from the master's breakfast. Oliver, shut that door behind Mr Noah and take your tea to that box and drink it there. Do you hear?"
"Do you hear, workhouse?"
said Noah Claypole. Charlotte burst out laughing, and Noah joined in. Then they both looked contemptuously at poor Oliver Twist as he sat trembling on the box in the coldest corner of the room, and ate the broken pieces which had been specially reserved for him. Noah was a charity boy, but not an orphan. He lived at home, but was supported by public money because his mother was a poor washerwoman and his father a drunken out-of-work soldier. For several months, Oliver suffered Noah's ill treatment of him without complaint, until one day something happened which indirectly produced a change in Oliver's life. Oliver and Noah had gone down into the kitchen at the usual dinner hour. Noah put his feet on the tablecloth and pulled Oliver's hair in order to annoy him. Since Oliver did not cry, he said to him,
"Workhouse, how's your mother?"
"She's dead," replied Oliver. "Don't say anything about her to me."
Oliver reddened as he said this. He breathed quickly, and there was a strange movement of the mouth and nose which Mr Claypole thought must be signs of an approaching fit of crying. He therefore returned to his insulting words.
"What did she die of, workhouse?"
he said.
"Of a broken heart, an old nurse told me," replied Oliver, as a tear rolled down his cheek.
"What has made you cry now?"
"Not you," replied Oliver, quickly brushing the tear away. "Don't imagine it's you."
"Oh, not me, eh?"
said Noah.
"No, not you,"
replied Oliver sharply.
"There, that's enough. You'd better not say anything more to me about her."
"Better not?"
exclaimed Noah.
"Well, better not. Workhouse, don't be rude. You know, workhouse, your mother was a bad woman."
"What did you say?"
inquired Oliver coldly.
"A bad woman, workhouse,"
replied Noah.
"and it's a good thing she died when she did, or else she would have been doing hard labour in prison, or she might have been hanged, which is more likely."
Red with anger, Oliver jumped to his feet. seized Noah by the throat, shook him hard, and knocked him to the ground.
"He'll murder me!"
shouted Noah.
"Charlotte, the new boy is going to murder me! Help! Help! Charlotte! Mrs. Sowerberry, help!"
Noah's shouts were answered by a loud scream from Charlotte, and a louder one from Mrs. Sowerberry, and they both rushed into the kitchen.
"Oh, you little horror!"
screamed Charlotte, seizing Oliver with all her strength and giving him several blows. Then Mrs. Sowerberry joined in. She held Oliver with one hand and ran the sharp nails on her other hand across his face. Now the danger had passed. Noah rose from the ground and beat him with a stick from behind. When they were all tired out, they dragged Oliver, struggling and shouting, into the cellar, and there locked him up. When this was done, Mrs. Sowerberry sank into a chair and burst into tears.
"Dear, dear, she's going to faint," said Charlotte. "A glass of water, Noah, please, quickly."
"Oh, Charlotte,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry, almost unable to breathe from the cold water which Noah had poured over her head and shoulders.
"we are fortunate that we have not all been murdered in our beds."
"Fortunate indeed, madam," was the reply. "I only hope this will teach master not to take in any more of these terrible creatures that are born to be murderers and robbers. Poor Noah! He was near death, madam, when I came in."
"Poor fellow,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry, looking sympathetically at the boy.
"What shall we do?
Your master's not at home. There's not a man in the house, and he'll kick that door down in 10 minutes. "Dear, dear, I don't know, madam," said Charlotte, "unless we send for the police officers."
"No, no,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry.
"Run to Mr. Bumble, Noah, and tell him to come here directly. Never mind your cap. Go quickly."
Noah ran as fast as he could until he reached the workhouse gates. Having rested here for a minute or so to collect some nice large tears, he knocked loudly at the gate.
"Mr. Bumble! Mr. Bumble!"
cried Noah so loudly that Mr. Bumble, who happened to be nearby, was alarmed and rushed into the yard without his hat.
"Oh, Mr. Bumble, sir,"
said Noah.
"Oliver, sir. Oliver has—"
"What? What?" interrupted Mr. Bumble. "Not run away? He hasn't run away, has he, Noah?"
"No, sir, no. Not run away, sir, but he's turned wild," replied Noah. "He tried to murder me, sir, and then tried to murder Charlotte, and then Mrs. Sowerberry. Oh, what a pain he has caused me, sir."
And here Noah twisted his body like a snake, thus giving Mr. Bumble the impression that he was badly hurt. Mr. Bumble, putting on his hat and taking his stick, accompanied Noah Claypole with all speed to the undertaker's shop. Mr. Sowerberry had not returned, and Oliver continued to kick at the cellar door. Mr. Bumble returned the kicks from the outside, and then, applying his mouth to the keyhole, said in a deep, impressive tone, "Oliver!"
"Let me out!"
replied Oliver from the inside. "Do you know this voice, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble.
"Yes,"
replied Oliver. "Aren't you afraid of it, sir? Aren't you trembling while I speak, sir?" demanded Mr. Bumble.
"No,"
replied Oliver confidently. Mr. Bumble stepped back from the keyhole, drew himself up to his full height, and looked from one to another of those who were watching.
"Oh, you know, Mr. Bumble, he must be mad,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry.
"No boy in half his senses would dare to speak to you like that."
"It's not madness, madam," replied Mr. Bumble after a moment's thought. "It's meat."
"What?"
exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry. "Meat, madam, meat," replied Mr. Bumble. "You fed him too much, madam. If you had kept the boy on soup, madam, this would never have happened."
"Dear, dear," exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry, "this is the result of being generous."
"Ah," said Mr. Bumble, "the only thing that can be done now is to leave him in the cellar for a day or so, till he's really hungry, and to take him out and keep him on soup all through his apprenticeship. He comes from a bad family, Mrs. Sowerberry. Both the nurse and the doctor said that his mother had made her way here despite difficulties and pain that would have killed any good woman weeks before."
At this point in Mr. Bumble's speech, Oliver, just hearing enough to know that some new reference was being made to his mother, started kicking violently at the door again. At this moment, Sowerberry returned. Oliver's offence having been explained to him in enough detail to make him shake with anger, he unlocked the cellar door and dragged Oliver out by the collar. Oliver's clothes had been torn in the beating he had received. His face was bruised and bleeding, and his hair was scattered over his forehead. But the angry colour had not disappeared, and when he was pulled out of his prison, he looked at Noah completely without fear.
"Now, you're a nice young fellow, aren't you?"
said Sowerberry, giving Oliver a shake and hitting him across one ear. "He called my mother names," replied Oliver.
"Well, and what if he did, you ungrateful child?"
said Mrs. Sowerberry.
"She deserved what he said, and worse."
"She didn't," said Oliver.
"She did,"
said Mrs. Sowerberry. "It's a lie," said Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry burst into a flood of tears. This flood of tears left Mr. Sowerberry no choice, so he at once gave Oliver a good beating, which satisfied even Mrs. Sowerberry herself, and made Mr. Bumble's use of his stick, which followed, rather unnecessary. For the rest of the day Oliver was shut up in the back kitchen, and at night Mrs. Sowerberry ordered him upstairs to his bed. It was not until he was left alone in the silence of the undertaker's dark workshop that Oliver gave way to his feelings. He had listened to their insults with contempt, and he had suffered the beatings without a cry. But now, when there was nobody to see or hear him, he fell upon his knees on the floor and, hiding his face in his hands, he cried such tears as, please God, few so young may ever have cause to pour out. For a long time Oliver remained motionless in this position. The lamp was burning low when he rose to his feet. Having looked slowly around him and listened carefully, he gently undid the bolts and chains on the door and glanced outside. It was a cold, dark night. There was no wind, and the dark shadows thrown by the trees on the ground looked frightening. He closed the door again, tied up the few articles of clothing he had, and sat down on a bench to wait for morning. With the first light that struggled through the windows, Oliver rose and again unlocked the door. After a brief pause in the doorway, he stepped outside, closed the door behind him, and was in the open street.